Hello, triple students. Welcome. This is a bit of a funny one because it's one of the only lessons that is a triple lesson sort of tacked on the end of one of the chapters for the biology paper 2 for AQA. So I thought we'd go through the basic parts of it. And then when you revisit this, when you're doing your combined science and your regular lessons, you'll be very familiar with it and you'll know a little bit more. So hopefully you'll be able to contribute more. So I'm just going to briefly skim over the combined stuff just to just to be sure that you're all okay, and then we're going to fly through to the very simple triple bits. It's kind of very standalone on its own. There's no other bits really that join on with it, and then we're going to move on to a different topic. So here I have a picture of a male and a female, and they both go through a process called meiosis. Now, meiosis is the process of making sex cells, so gametes, eggs and sperm. Okay, and when an egg and a sperm meet, they fuse together, and that is called fertilization, and they make a zygote, and that undergoes mitosis, and that develops into a baby. Okay, so today's lesson is about how different organisms reproduce. So we're not going to go through human reproduction. That's going to come up in a different topic, and that comes up in combined. I just sort of wanted to show you a picture. So today we are going to be looking at explaining why different types of variation is achieved through reproduction. So there's a couple of starter questions there. Which features of yourself did you inherit from your parents? Which of your features are environmental? Now, these are two questions that can come with a lot of misunderstanding. So maybe you want to pause it and write down your initial answers, and then we'll go through those. Okay, which features of yourself did you inherit from your parents? The answer is obviously all of them. You have exactly 50% of your mother's genetics and 50% of your father's genetics. Now, a lot of people make the common misconception of saying, oh, I've inherited more genes from my dad because I look more like my dad. No, you've still inherited 50% of your genes, just the chances are that the genes that you are expressing are dominant from your father or your mother or whatever. So you look more like one parent usually because they have passed on the more dominant genes. But you get a combination of genes from your parents. So some people look nothing like their parents, and that's because they're sort of a perfect mix of their genetics. And other people tend to have quite dominant traits. So for example, I'm from a family where all of my siblings have brown eyes. I'm the only one with blue eyes. So I've obviously inherited 2 recessive blue-eyed genes from my brown-eyed parents. Or there's something they're not telling me. Which of your features are environmental? So again, because I'm selfish and I like talking about myself, the feature of mine that's clearly environmental is that I bleach my hair, I dye my hair. I wasn't born with peroxide blonde hair, so some features on you will be environmental or they could be genetic. So let's go through some of these examples. So let's look at earlobes. Now, the person on the left has got an attached earlobe. That is where there is no gap between the earlobe and the head. The person on the right has got a free hanging earlobe. So there's clearly a gap between the head and the earlobe. This is purely genetic, and you can't change this unless you were to snip your earlobe. Maybe if in your family, have a look at your siblings, your parents, your grandparents, and ask them whether their lobes are attached or unattached. And you might be able to see a pattern forming as to whether which trait is dominant. Is it usual to pass on the free hanging earlobe? So this is a genetic piece of variation. So variation is a difference. This is a genetic variation. You can't environmentally change the shape of your ears. Well, you can, but it would be... So just a reminder when I'm talking about genes, so genes are found in the nucleus, and they are a little section of your chromosomes that are made of DNA. And your genes are what code proteins, and those proteins show us our characteristics. So here we can see these are the chromosomes. They're made up of coiled up DNA, and a section of DNA will be a gene. So let's have a look at these. So in the blue boxes, there is a piece of variation, and you've got to decide whether they are genetic, environmental, or both. So having a scar where a tattoo has been removed, genetic, environmental, or both? It's environmental because scars are achieved throughout your lifetime. You're not born with scars. I have lots of scars, but my daughter wasn't born with scars. You gain those over your lifetime. They're environmental. Having red hair. Well, questionable. If you've naturally got red hair, then that is genetic. If you have dyed your hair red, that would be environmental. See, it depends. Being the tallest in the class. Now, generally, this is genetic. Your height is really interesting because environmentally you can determine it. If you're undernourished, then you can not achieve necessarily your actual height. So, but yes, that's genetic. Being the thinnest in the class. Similar to height, so there is genetic characteristic here, but also environmental as to whether you exercise, you nourish well. So this one's one, but generally, yeah, genetic. Suffering from cystic fibrosis, that is a disease that affects the membranes in your lungs and your digestive system, causes them to produce a thick mucus and fibrils. That is a genetic disease. You can't gain that from the environment. Suffering from scurvy. Now, scurvy is caused by vitamin C deficiency and makes your teeth look all gross like pirates. I think that is a green. It's a very funny colour on my screen, but it is green. It's environmental. If you don't have enough vitamin C, you get scurvy. So eat some oranges and some strawberries. Having lung cancer. Interesting one, this. So you can be genetically predisposed to having lung cancer, but you can also put yourself in a situation where you're smoking and you can trigger lung cancer. So that one is both. So let's go back to reproduction. What is reproduction? So it's something that all living things can do. That's why I've got Mrs. Gren written there. It's a life process, and it's one of the characteristics of all living things. So it must occur to ensure the survival of a living species. Plants, animals, bacteria, all living organisms have to reproduce, otherwise they are not living. This is one of the reasons why viruses can't reproduce on their own. They have to have a host. I suppose like malaria does as well, technically. The way things reproduce can be very, very different indeed. So we're going to be looking at that. So there are two types of reproduction, sexual and asexual. So you need to know the unique features of sexual and asexual reproduction. Okay. So I can't remember the slide. There we go. So if you reproduce sexually, it means that there are two parents, which means that you have two sets of genes coming together, which means that you have genetic variation. You will not produce a clone of one of the parents. Whereas an asexual reproduction, only one parent is required and cells undergo mitosis to clone themselves or copy themselves. So copy out the passage, filling in the missing word. You might want to pause it. So some organisms can reproduce I suppose that one's probably going to be clone. Only one parent is needed and there are no gametes, so they are sex cells. There is no mixing of genetic information from two parents. There is no genetic variation among the offspring. The offspring are genetically identical to each other and the parent. These genetically identical offspring are called clones. So asexual reproduction is just causes a carbon copy of the original. An example of producing asexually a carbon copy of the original, taking a cutting of a plant. So spider plants are a really good example. They have these sort of offshoots that then go and embed themselves in the ground, and they are a complete clone of the original plant. Strawberries do it, brambles do it. Anywhere where you have these offshoots. And ivy, if you cut a bit of ivy, plant it, it will produce an exact clone, genetically identical to the original. Clones are formed by cell division, so bacteria, amoeba, and other single-celled organisms reproduce asexually. They just divide. They just copy themselves, undergo mitosis, produce the same as the original. Some multi-celled organisms, like hydra and some species of sponge, reproduce asexually by producing buds. And So they kind of produce a bud on the side, and they break away and they become a new organism, even though they're genetically identical to the original. So let's play sexual or asexual reproduction. So here are some statements, and you've got to say whether they are sexual or asexual reproduction. Now you might want to just put two titles in your book, like a table, sexual, asexual, and then jot them down as to which goes in each. So there are two parents, and genetic information is passed on from both of these to the offspring. Sexual or asexual? It's sexual, because of two. The offspring are clones of their parents. It's asexual. The colour green on here is rubbish on my screen. There is only one parent, and all the genetic information is passed to the offspring from its one parent. It's asexual. There is more genetic variation in this type of reproduction. Variation, more than one gene. It's sexual. No genetic variation. That's got to be asexual. Okay, so we need to know, this is the triple part, we need to know three specific reproductions. So we need to know plants, malaria, and fungi, and how they reproduce. So I've gone a bit simple on the plants because you would have done this in year 7, but you might want to look up all of the way plants reproduce. So let's start with asexually. So plants, if you cut them, trim them, etc., they grow back. That's because they undergo mitosis and because they have stem cells in their meristems. So they can quite easily just clone tissue that has been removed. They also can produce runners, and they can produce bulbs. And particularly bulbs are really good if sexual reproduction hasn't been done. So if you think about daffodils, for example, daffodil bulbs just stay under the soil and up they pop every year, clone of the original. But daffodils can also reproduce sexually as well. So we can take advantage of plant reproduction because of cloning, tissue culturing, and they undergo mitosis just to keep dividing and producing a clone. So like I said earlier, spider plants, strawberries, brambles, any of those that produce runners or offshoots, they're reproducing asexually. Sexually, I've done a little diagram here. So remember that every plant has both male and female sex organs, and so can produce male and female gametes. So I've got a little picture here of the eggs, the flower. And so eggs are held in the ovary of a plant in the bottom of that green section. So the top's called the stigma, and the bottom is the ovary. And the stamen has an anther on the end of it, and the anther produces pollen grains. Now that is the male gamete, the male sex cell, and the female gamete, the egg, is in the ovary. So we rely on insects and the wind and all sorts of things for pollen, excuse me, to be transferred from the anther to the stigma of either the same plants. They can self-sexually pollinate, which is a little bit crazy, or they can pollinate a different flower. Now, the reason why they're sexual is because they are two different gametes, and they will have two different types of genetic information. So when the pollen lands on the stigma, it grows a tubule down to the egg, fertilization happens, and then we get seeds. Sexual and asexual plants are clever. So let's move on and talk about fungi. So fungi are a little bit more interesting because they can do, and they most commonly do, asexual reproduction. So what happens is, I'm not keen on this diagram, but it is quite a simple one from the textbook. So there's a mushroom at the top there, that's a fungi. So they will produce spores, and so they will do cell division, mitosis in the hyphae, and they will produce spores. Now these spores then can grow genetically identical fungi in like the same area. In bad conditions, so fungi like warm, moist environments, so if an environment's quite dry, it might not be able to reproduce successfully because it's not well adapted. So then it might need to sexually reproduce. So what will happen is two hyphae, so these are parts of a fungi, will produce. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. So hyphae of two mushrooms from the spores will fuse together like fertilization. So you now produce like a new hypha, which has got two types of genetic information. So you then get a zygote, and then that will reproduce, and it will produce new spores which are genetically different from the original. So you get different offspring, and quite often they're better adapted to the environment they've been created in. So I'm sorry I made that a little bit more complicated than it needed to be. So most commonly they produce spores, and the spores germinate to create a new fungus, and they are genetic clones. They just grow via mitosis. Or two hyphae might fuse to create genetic information, and usually better adapted for the environment they're in. Malaria. So malaria reproduces in two different ways. First of all, it depends where the malaria is living. So if the malaria is living in a human, so let's say you get infected with malaria because you've been bitten by a mosquito, you will have malaria in your body, and the malaria will reproduce in your liver and blood cells. So just via mitosis, it will just keep reproducing. And the second one is sexually. So the sexual form of malaria is found in blood cells, in red blood cells. So if you get bitten by a mosquito, there's like a 20-minute window in which this can occur. So it has to be like the perfect temperature, and it has to be after a feed, really. So obviously malaria lives inside mosquitoes, and when a mosquito is biting a human, they're taking in red blood cells from that human, but they also contain malaria in their own blood cells. So what happens is that the red blood cells burst, and the chromosomes, or the genes that were in that blood cell, are released, and combine with the malaria in the mosquito, and so therefore you get two different forms of malaria fusing together to give two sets of chromosomes that then undergo meiosis, and then they can produce a new set of malaria, a different, slightly varied set of malaria parasites. It says asexual parasites. Malaria is a protozoa, which can then infect a new person. So that mosquito now has two variants of malaria in there. And so obviously, it's mostly the females. If they're moving from person to person, they might get many different types. I can see a spelling mistake. It then undergoes emesis. It's meant to be meiosis. Sorry about that. In terms of the three you need to know, fungi, malaria, and plants, keep it simple. So I would just make sure that you know that both of them can do sexually and asexually, and it's usually conditional. So keep it simple. Keep your notes simple. I found the malaria one quite difficult to wrap my head around, so you might want to go on Bite Size and have a look at those, and I'll see if I can find some stuff on Doddle to set you as well. Take care. Bye.